I still think about the house I lived in just after my divorce, back in the winter of '98. It was a drafty Victorian set back from the road, the kind of place that made noises like a settling ship whenever the temperature dropped. I was 40 years old, entirely alone for the first time in my adult life, and I hadn't yet learned the difference between solitude and isolation. It was late February, a Tuesday, I believe, and a blizzard had been burying the county since noon. The roads were closed, the power lines were heavy with ice, and the silence in that living room was so absolute it felt like pressure against my eardrums. I was sitting in a wingback chair, watching the snow pile up against the window glass, holding a book I wasn't actually reading. That was when the phone rang. It wasn't the digital trill we're used to now, but the jarring, mechanical scream of an old rotary landline that sat on the hallway table. I didn't answer it immediately. There was no one I wanted to talk to, and certainly no one who would be calling me at 1 in the morning during a storm. I let it ring 4 times, listening to the sound echo off the bare hardwood floors, counting the seconds between the peals. On the 5th ring, a strange instinct took over, a sudden, desperate need to hear a human voice, any voice, and I got up. I walked into the hallway, the floorboards cold under my socks, and lifted the receiver. I didn't say hello. I just held the heavy black plastic against my ear and listened to the static of the line. After a moment, a woman's voice came through. She sounded breathless, frantic, and entirely too close. "I saw the lights," she said. "I saw the lights go off in the kitchen, so I know you're there. Don't you dare hang up on me again." I should have told her she had the wrong number. That is what a rational person does. That is the social contract we all sign. But I stood there, frozen in the dark hallway, mesmerized by the raw, unguarded intensity in her tone. It was a voice stripped of all pretense, a voice that belonged to a woman at the end of her rope. I realized in that split second that if I spoke, if I told her I wasn't who she thought I was, she would be embarrassed, and the connection would break, and I would be back in the silence of that empty house. So I did something selfish. I said nothing. I let my breathing synchronize with hers. I let her believe, just for a moment, that I was the man she needed to reach. It was a cruelty born of my own loneliness, but at the time, it felt like necessity. She took my silence as an answer, perhaps a sullen one, but an answer nonetheless. Her voice dropped an octave, shifting from anger to a pleading kind of exhaustion. She began to talk, the words tumbling out in a rapid, shivering stream. She talked about a car that wouldn't start, about a child named sensory details of a life I didn't know, a fever that wouldn't break, a check that hadn't cleared 3 times in a row. She spoke of the snow trapping her, of the fear of the dark, of the crushing weight of doing it all alone. As she spoke, I closed my eyes and leaned my head against the wall. I began to construct a picture of her in my mind, a kitchen with yellow wallpaper, a table cluttered with unpaid bills, a window looking out onto the same relentless snow that was burying me. The longer she talked, the more I felt a strange, phantom guilt settling onto my shoulders. Even though I wasn't the man she was angry with, I began to feel like him. I felt the weight of her disappointment as if I had earned it. I realized that the grievances she was listing, the emotional distance, the silence, the refusal to engage, were the exact same crimes my ex-wife had charged me with in divorce court only months prior. This stranger wasn't just yelling at a wrong number. She was holding a mirror up to my own failures. I stood there, gripping the phone cord, sweating despite the chill in the house, forced to listen to a catalog of sins that could have easily been my own. It was a penance I hadn't known I needed, delivered by a ghost on a copper wire. Then the tone of the call shifted again. She stopped complaining. The silence stretched out for 10 seconds, maybe 15, and I heard the unmistakable sound of a match being struck, followed by a long, shaky exhale of smoke. "I'm not mad anymore," she said, her voice sounding incredibly small, sounding younger than she had a moment ago. "I'm just tired, Jim. I'm so tired of fighting you. I just need to know if you're coming over tonight. The roads are bad, I know, and I know you're angry, but I don't want to be alone in this house. The wind is making that noise in the attic again." Her vulnerability was terrifying. It required a response. To stay silent now felt less like an observation and more like a violation. This was the moment to speak. I opened my mouth to say, "I'm sorry, you have the wrong number," but the words caught in my throat. I imagined her reaction, the shock, the humiliation, the sudden click of the line deadening the air. I imagined her sitting in her kitchen, realizing she had just poured her heart out to a stranger who had been silently judging her, or worse, pitying her. I couldn't do it. I couldn't add that shame to her burden. But I also couldn't lie and say I was coming. I was trapped in a moral gray zone, a purgatory of my own making. My hand shook as I held the receiver. Outside, the wind howled against the siding, rattling the old window frames, a physical manifestation of the turmoil inside the line. I took a deep breath, trying to make my voice sound gentle, trying to strip away the gravel of my own identity. I spoke for the first and only time. "I can't come tonight," I said softly. "The roads are too dangerous. But you aren't alone. You're going to be okay. Just lock the doors and keep the lights on." It was a generic comfort, a fraudulent kindness, but it was the best I could offer. There was a long pause on the other end. I waited for the confusion, for the question, "Who is this?" But it never came. Perhaps the connection was bad, or perhaps she was so desperate for reassurance that she didn't care where it came from. She just let out a long, shuddering sigh, a sound of tension leaving the body. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay. That's all I needed to hear. Just drive safe when you do come." And then she hung up. The click was final, severing the invisible thread that had tied us together across the miles of snow and darkness. I stood there for a long time, the dial tone buzzing in my ear like an angry insect, before I finally placed the receiver back in its cradle. The silence of the house rushed back in, but it felt different now. It wasn't just empty, it was heavy with the echo of that conversation. I walked back to the living room and looked out the window. I tried to imagine where she was, this woman who loved a man named Jim, wondering if Jim was out there in the storm or if Jim was somewhere else entirely, indifferent to the woman waiting for him. I never found out who she was. I never tried to trace the call, and she never called back. But 20 years later, I still think about that night whenever it snows. I think about the man she thought she was talking to, and I wonder if he ever understood the grace he was given that night. The grace of being forgiven simply because someone needed him to be there. I think about my own life, the conversations I walked away from, the silences I used as weapons. That night didn't fix me, and it didn't bring my wife back, but it changed the way I listen. Now, when the phone rings late at night, I answer it. And I speak first. I make sure the person on the other end knows exactly who I am, because I know now how much it hurts to speak your heart into the dark, hoping someone, anyone, is listening.